Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for sharing your responses. It's so great to see folks from different communities and affiliations in this session and to get a sense of why you've all come here today. There are about 170 of us registered for this session, so welcome. My name is Miriam Nababi. I use the pronouns she, her, hers, and I'm with the Equity and Inclusion Office at UBC. This event today is part of a suite of activities related to IBPOC Connections, an initiative of the EIO, which is designed to enhance the experiences and outcomes of Indigenous, Black, and people of color faculty and staff at UBC. This event today has come together in partnership between IBPOC Connections, the Health, Wellbeing, and Benefits Unit in Human Resources at UBC, and a senior advisor to the Provost on Racialized Faculty. It is also an honor to share that it's a cross-institutional partnership with Douglas College. As we begin, I would like to acknowledge and give thanks to the Hunkaminam speaking Musqueam people on whose traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands UBC is located on, and to the Kikite and Coquitlam First Nations on whose unceded and traditional lands Douglas College is located on. I recognize that we're all tuning in from different traditional lands across provinces and would like to give a moment of pause for each of us to reflect on where we're situated. I would also like to acknowledge my racialized colleagues who have helped in making this event possible. Elida Joyce, Asman Chen, Gabrielle Bonifacio, and our moderator, True Love Tomasi. It takes a village, as they say. It's also a privilege to have Dr. Manal Matani, who serves as the Senior Advisor to the Provost on Racialized Faculty, partner with us on this event, and I'll turn it over to her in a moment to say a few words. So our intention today is to contribute to the project of community building, which is central to the mandate of IBPOC Connections, in a way that is, as Bell Hooks says, grounded in love and respect. And for us, a precursor to building community is individual well-being. And this session was conceived in response to the question of how we engage in well-being and self-care when so many of us are in survival mode. And so by survival, I'm referring not only to the very practical challenges that I think we're all facing at different decibels, I'm also referring to the self-care that is needed when the existing vulnerabilities that we experience based on our identities and belongings are, in this moment in time, punctuated by the differential treatment that has surfaced during the pandemic, which many of us are all too familiar with. And so this session is a dive into exploring what radical self-care can look like for IBPOC folks by both pointing to the ways in which our well-being is intrinsically tied to the systems in which we're a part of, and also offering strategies and approaches that go beyond dominant narratives of self-care, which I think we're also all too familiar with. This session is an invitation for all of us to be vulnerable and an opportunity to come together in a time when we may individually and collectively be feeling more isolated, alone, or afraid, and maybe even to reimagine what well-being can look like for IBPOC folks within the institutional spaces that many of us are part of. To get a sense of where we're all coming from into this session, we have a question that we'd like you to respond to. If you go to the chat, there will be a link that you can copy and paste into your browser if you haven't already done so from the first question. And the question that will pop up is, what are 3 emotions related to COVID for you? What are 3 emotions that are related to COVID for you? I'll give you a moment to input your responses. Stress and anxiety, I see are popping up. Fear. We'll continue to have these pop up over the next minute or so. I think this is so point on with how we've been thinking about and conceiving this session. think much of what's been highlighted will surface in the discussion today as we're thinking through, as we were thinking through what would be most valuable to amplify as part of this conversation. We saw three overarching areas that I can really see here. Those for us were IBPOC-specific experiences with well-being. And here, thinking about the ways in which community and shared experience are central ingredients to well-being, particularly for IBPOC folks. The challenges we face at an individual level, as well as the forms of racism and discrimination that we've directly or indirectly been impacted by, and engaging in well-being through self-care and how self-care can be tied to collective action. So you're in for a treat as we have a diverse panel who'll be offering their perspectives on these very topics from different angles today. Before we formally launch in, a few housekeeping items to ensure that the session runs smoothly. Please mute yourself so that everyone can hear the speaker clearly. If you've not already done so, you can use speaker view. That way you'll be able to see both the slides on the shared screen as well as the speaker. And please reserve chat for Q&A and resource sharing. We'll have a couple of people monitoring chat and we'll synthesize the questions and we'll share the resources afterwards via email. And with respect to questions, given that this is a dedicated IBPOC space, we will be making a point to prioritize questions that center IBPOC experiences. If we have time at the end, we'll get to other questions that might arise. Before I turn it over to our moderator, True Love Tumasi, in leading us through the session, I'd like to invite Dr. Manal Mitani, who's an associate professor in the Institute for Social Justice and senior advisor to the Provost on Racialized Faculty at UBC, to say a few words. Manal, who also serves on the IBPOC Connections Advisory, has been a steadfast advocate for the important work of bridging opportunities between faculty and staff at UBC. So welcome, Manal, and I'll turn it over to you.
Can you hear me now? I'm always checking with these things. Good morning, everybody. Mariam, thank you so much for that nice introduction. And I'm really delighted that many of you are able to attend today. I think the fact that we have so many groundbreaking participants speaks to the importance of this topic at this moment in time. Audre Lorde's words echo in my mind as I think about self-care as an act of political warfare. I think of the everyday lives of Asian, Black, Brown, and Indigenous bodies, trans folks, queer folks, and how so many are disproportionately feeling the impacts of COVID-19. As many racialized individuals face forms of anti-Asian racism, and our communities can no longer meet in person to receive the spiritual rejuvenation we so desperately require, I worry about the mental health of our racialized communities. Racism stresses our minds, souls, and bodies. So I'm very pleased to be a co-sponsor for today's event, and I know that we are in excellent hands with our esteemed panelists. We're working closely with the Equity and Inclusion Office, and in particular IBPOC Connections, to create spaces for connections, and I'd like to tell you about those initiatives very briefly. One of the things we're doing is working on launching a survey to begin to tabulate the experiences of our community at UBC in light of COVID-19. We know that there's multiple forms of racism that are being harnessed and deployed in this moment, along with the racism directed at Asian people in our communities. There are also reports of anti-Black racism going on in southern China, ongoing experiences of racism of Black bodies in the States, as the recent harassment of Chris Cooper in Central Park clearly illustrates. Black people continue to experience harassment, evictions, and are barred from restaurants and other spaces in our city. Our Premier, John Horgan, cavalierly stated that there is no place for hate in this province, and I unfortunately have to disagree. There's undoubtedly a place for hate, and we see it take shape in our social landscape precisely because of the ongoing racial hierarchies that are worsening daily. This show of hate is unacceptable, and it is crucial to commit to connection, collaboration, and transparency, particularly through the events like what we're experiencing today. I will continue to challenge anti-Blackness as well as anti-Asian racism at this moment, at all moments, and I hope you will too. I also want to tell you about an event we're hoping to share with you on July 16th with the writer Eternity Martis, who's written an extraordinary memoir about what it means to be Black on Canadian university campuses. Her book, They Told Me This Would Be Fun, is a scathing but clear-eyed indictment of the racism at our universities. You can sign up for that event on the EIO website. And we are distributing free copies of the book through the Indigenous-owned bookstore, Massey Books, and they deliver. I hope to see you on Zoom for that event. What an event like today's does is ensure that if you are feeling vulnerable, there are spaces where you can reach out. Today we'll create a space with other racialized people who understand your experiences. You are not alone. I hope you will find the conversation both productive and rejuvenating. Welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Manel, for the opening and the really poignant remarks. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our session today on radical self-care for IBPOC communities, strategies for well-being. My name is Trulove Chimisi, and I use the pronouns she, her, hers. I work in human resources at UBC with the Health and Wellbeing and Benefits team. It's a great pleasure to be with you all today as we engage remotely in this ever-changing reality that we all find ourselves in. I'd also like to remind everyone that this session is being recorded and will be available for future viewing and reference. You are all also muted upon entry to the Zoom meeting today, so please use this chat box to ask questions and participate, and we will do our best to address them during the question and answer period. And also use the speaker view to see the slides and the shared screen, and also to see the person that is speaking. So today we have a really great session planned, and I would like for us to get started. As Miriam stated, we would like to explore what radical self-care looks like for Indigenous, Black, and people of color within the community and institutional spaces that many of us are a part of. So the session today is divided into 3 parts. We will begin by getting some insight into the relationship between land and wellness, followed by a guided breathing practice as a source of connection and well-being. Next, we will hear from our panel of experts and discuss the value of radical self-care with a brief question and answer period. And then lastly, we will examine the role of radical self-care in the workplace and within institutional culture pertaining to diversity, followed by another brief Q&A period. So to begin, we would like to hear from Linnea Dick, a motivational speaker and creative writer from the Kwakwaka'wakw and Tsimshian nations located in British Columbia. She's an advocate for Indigenous youth culture and assault victims through her public speaking work, and she is currently writing her first book, which is really exciting to hear. So Linnea will speak on the relationship between land and wellness and provide us some insights from Indigenous knowledge when it comes to the ethics of care. So I'll hand it over to Linnea.
Thank you so much for that awesome introduction. So my name is Linnea Dick, and I come from the Kwakwaka'wakw, Nisga'a, and Tsimshian nations on the northwest coast of BC. And my Kwakwaka'wakw name given to me is Maladi, which means to have a destiny, but that on your way to your destiny, you are constantly being pulled in different directions, and that every stop along the way is where you're meant to be. And I always like to share this because it is with that power that I'm here with all of you today. I also want to share a little bit about myself. I am a poet, I am a curator, a writer, a public speaker, an advocate. I wear so many hats within my own community and the world at large. And each of those hats is a gift that I've been given through some of the challenges that I've faced in my life. I also want to talk a little bit more about the land acknowledgement. I think so often we can get lost in what that land acknowledgement actually means. When we hear someone say we'd like to acknowledge the people of this land, sometimes it can be misconstrued or miscommunicated that we are acknowledging ownership of the land. But what we're really acknowledging is a long-standing relationship that people of the land have had with Mother Earth for a long, long, long time. The reason we like to acknowledge this relationship is because Mother Earth is our family. It's not because we're owners, it's because we must hold her in the highest regard, and Indigenous people, as a part of our beliefs and values, tend to do that. We are often advocates and activists of taking care of the world. Now, before I jump into my talk, I do want to share a few words because I've introduced myself, but I want to introduce my spirit. So I'm going to share a very short poem so that people at home and the ancestors that may be with you wherever you are today can hear my spirit. And this poem I actually wrote as a reflection of the current state of affairs and the lonely feelings that I was going through when COVID first struck. I'm used to being able to, I live urban, I'm used to being able to travel to my home as often as I'd like to, and at least once or twice a month to connect to my own home territory and my people. But right now, the greatest way that I can support my community is by staying away and ensuring that they are safe and protected and not exposed to any COVID-19 that has already occurred in my community. And so here is my poem. Reminder. You are greater than any fear. You are still here, and that takes resilience. You have fallen before, and yet still, here you stand with strength stretched from your roots to your branches. I believe that you can get through anything, and that is why I believe that I can too. We're in this together. And I wrote that as a reminder to myself that I'm never alone. We are all very connected. And one of the things that connects everyone is the land. Now, before I jump into that discussion, I just want to mention that I have notes in front of me in case I get lost in my words, which has been happening to me a lot lately, much more than usual because I'm not used to socializing anymore. And that is one of the challenges that I've been faced with. Is that disconnection from people and not knowing how to use my voice and share my gifts as gracefully as I normally would. But I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the land. That the land that we stand on is so resilient. It has experienced such tragedy. It has lost its limbs. It has had its circulation system polluted in the waterways. Its very breath is constrained because of the pollution in the air. But nonetheless, this land holds strength. And we carry that strength as well when we have that connection to the land. Indigenous people have always seen land as a way to take care of ourselves, as long as we are also taking care of the land. You can see this in the way that we built our houses, in the way that we made our clothes, the materials that we used in everything we do. And as a fine example of what that might look like, our children were carved rattles out of our cedar and painted with pictures that told stories of where they come from, their ancestors, the strength that has been passed on down to them through generations and generations. COVID-19 is particularly challenging for Indigenous people because of that connection to land. It has become dangerous for many of us to even step outside ourselves. But as I've learned in my traditions, that land is everywhere. Even the houses we live in, parts of the land have been taken and rematerialized and rebuilt so that we can live within them. And it's become so radical just to take care of ourselves. We live in these block houses that are made out of fragments of our Mother Earth, but we often forget to take care of ourselves by connecting to her. It is radical to take care of ourselves the same way it is radical to take care of our Mother Earth. That is not the intention of the society that was built around us. The intention of this society is for us to be servants to a higher power, which is authoritative. which often doesn't take care of us, and many of us are slaves. And so to take care of ourselves is just radical, and it's difficult and it's challenging. But I encourage everyone to rise to that challenge. And one of the reasons why I believe that the connection to land, when it comes to Indigenous people, has always been an important value, is because we understand that land sparks creativity, that we can take pieces of the land and mold them and create more beauty. We can retell our stories. We can take care of each other with pieces of the land. We can keep ourselves warm. We can nourish our bodies. There's so many ways in which we can connect to land and also take care of ourselves. And creative spirit is really important because creative spirit gives us a purpose in life. It gives us something that we can share with others. And the Indigenous perspective of what creativity is much different than what we believe art is in modern day society. Art is often seen as things that we can hang on the walls and look at, things like this beautiful painting behind me. But art is so much more than that. And for a lot of Indigenous people, we didn't have a word for art because it was expressed through our creativity, that creative spirit. And for a lot of Indigenous people, we've struggled to find that connection because of all these cement buildings around us, because some of our mother has been taken away from us, has been cut down. And so I like to share these things, even though it might sound as if, you know, I'm being an activist or I'm lecturing. The reason I like to share these things is so that everyone can have that understanding of yourself, that if you ever feel disconnected in this world, that it is not your fault. We live in a world that was purposely created with the intention of disconnection. And that's what colonization did to Indigenous people and does to the world at large. Indigenous people are not the only people that experience these difficulties connecting to our deeper selves and our purpose in life. And connecting to land is something that we can all do when we remember that we're connected to it all the time. We can bring pieces of it with us places. An exercise I like to do is I like to carry a rock. And whenever I feel upset, I play with that rock because of a story that my dad told me about Raven and the rock. And in this story, Raven becomes really angry at this rock and he begins beating it, only to find that in his victory, when he goes to celebrate, he realizes that it's his own knuckles that are bleeding. He bows to the rock and he thanks it for the lesson. And so these lessons are available to us all the time, and we can find ways to incorporate them into our lives. And so before moving on to the next person, I just wanted to share an exercise that helps me connect to land every day. And I usually do this exercise through meditation, but I've also done this exercise through poetry, through painting. Whatever your creative spirit is being called to do is how you can do it. But because I'm on this online video stream, what I'm going to do is I'm going to view it as a visualization. And so the reason why we want to practice connecting to land every day is because land and creativity, land sparks creativity because it is all. Land is all. And so when we are with the earth and with the land, our creativity and our imaginations are enlivened. They become like so connected to everything. And you know, anything becomes possible. But when we're not able to get outside or able to get outside safely and access the same land that we normally would, it's important to try to bring that land into your life. And so one of the ways that I like to do this is through an activity called What Landscape Are You? And What Landscape Are You encourages you to look at yourself and express your feelings without having to use words. And this can be so important for someone like me who's still learning to share their emotions. It's an uncomfortable feeling. It feels unsafe sometimes just thinking about sharing our emotions. So we need to find ways to do that without using those words, without having to say, I feel angry, I feel sad, I feel depressed, I feel alone. There are other ways that we can still say those things through our spirit. And so for me, as someone who used to be an alcoholic, having these simple ways that I can connect to land every day are ways that I can cope. In my 3 years of being sober, I have not felt challenged in my sobriety until now, until being stuck at home, feeling bored, feeling alone, feeling disconnected. And so it's important to have those good ways of coping, because otherwise we turn to the more harmful ways that we can cope. And what I was taught is that when we see someone harming themselves as a way to cope, that they have acknowledged that they need help. They've acknowledged that they need something to make them feel better. And so something we can do for them is give them something new to make them feel better, or give that gift to ourselves. And so I invite you all just to take a moment to think of how you're feeling in this moment. What is your energy feeling like? For me, it's a little bit nervous, a little bit distracted, but I'm also very thankful to be here, and that's how I feel right now. And once you've taken that moment to acknowledge yourself, to say, I am here and this is who I am right now, I want you to think about what landscape you would be. You can imagine a place that you wish you could be right now in your current feeling. You can imagine your favorite place to go. You can imagine a brand new place that you wish existed, and even include the impossible. Rivers running in skies, like many of the Indigenous legends depict. So take a moment to imagine your landscape. What does that look like for you today? What is the weather like? Sorry, everyone. Hi, Linnea. I'm on my phone, so I just had to quickly check that message. So I want you to imagine what that landscape looks like. And once you have it, no matter what it looks like, whether you're in a forest, whether you're in the middle of an ocean, wherever you are, I want you to imagine some sort of stream. It can be a river, it can be an ocean, or maybe it's just the dew on the grass. And I want you to remind yourself that that water is connecting you to everything, that you are never alone. And then I want you to imagine a piece of earth. Even if you're in the middle of the ocean and there's no land around you and that's your landscape, I want you to think of somewhere deep, deep below you that you are connected to land, you're connected to ground, and that ground gives you strength. And then I want you to think for yourself of one thing in your landscape that can offer you a specific strength. Maybe it's a stream that reminds you to go with the flow. Maybe it's a tree that reminds you that you are strong. Whatever it is you need, and that is the connection we have to land, that it always provides what we need. Now, I did go over time a little bit, so I thank you all for your patience and indulging me. please take this exercise with you. If you do want to creatively express this exercise and write a poem or write or draw or paint or meditate or dance or sing, please do so. And I hope this was helpful for you, Kayla Kasla. And again, thank you everyone for indulging me and letting me go a little bit over time.
Thank you so much, Linnea, for the beautiful poem and reflection on the connection to the land that we stand on. So we'll go to our next speaker, and next we have Sasha Rahantula. Sasha has a background in social work and counseling and found a deepened connection to her own South Asian culture and heritage through yoga, and continues to access and share this practice as a key self-care tool. So now Sasha will lead us through a guided breathing practice. Sasha.
Thank you. Hopefully everyone can hear me. So that was so beautiful, Linnea. Thank you so much. I am just really excited to be here, very excited to be with everybody, honored to be asked to share. So like we said, my background is in social work counseling. I discovered yoga as a teen, and it was really a key turning point for me in terms of understanding my heritage, feeling connected to it, which is something that I have definitely struggled with throughout my life. So I'm thrilled to kind of bring some of the things that I use as self-care to us today. So since we're on Zoom, we won't be doing too much yoga, but we'll be really getting into our bodies through our breath. So just remember that I can't see you, no one can see you, no one's watching, so feel free. Your mic is off, but we can't hear you breathing or anything, so be as loud as you'd like. And anytime we really take time to tune in to our bodies, we might uncover something, right? We might find something there that maybe has not been at the forefront. So if something comes up for you that is too much or a lot, just give yourself space, maybe back off if it's too much. If you want some support in debriefing, I'm more than happy to support after I finish speaking. You're welcome to send me a chat and we can debrief together, because I recognize that might bring up things for people. But we'll just start by rolling our shoulders back and down, coming into our body. So really just maybe softening your gaze or closing your eyes. My voice should be enough to guide you. So just roll those shoulders back and down, paying attention to your breath, just noticing where you feel that breath. And then maybe just switching directions with your shoulders, bringing them forward and down. And in the meantime, maybe just consciously breathing in through your nose and out through your nose or mouth. And then I invite you again to close your eyes or soften your gaze and just bring your attention to your feet. So maybe just bringing your feet flat on the ground beneath you, getting comfortable in your seat, whatever that seat might be. So just noticing the sensation of your feet on the ground, just tuning in there. Maybe starting by sending our breath there. So sending our breath somewhere in our body is a use of our mind. So we're just using our mind to send our breath there, connect to those feet, really feel them on the ground. And we're just tuning in here. We're just tuning into our bodies. And I remind you that anything I say that doesn't fit for you, doesn't feel right for you, you can leave it. Just take what fits. So bringing our attention back to our feet, And then slowly, we're just going to imagine a circle of energy, light, whatever fits for you, maybe circling our feet and also circling our ankles. So we're bringing this energy slowly from our feet into our ankles. And just connecting our breath to that part of our body. Maybe we're breathing a little deeper, a little slower than when we began. No judgment. We're not here to judge our bodies or our breath. We're just noticing. And slowly bringing that circle of light or energy up into our calves. And just imagine our breath being there. Imagining our muscles, joints, our blood, every part of our body just breathing, just reconnecting to all the things that are happening within our bodies. So we're just in the calves, envisioning that circle, bringing our breath and our focus up into our knees. Just taking a moment again to breathe into these places. You might find as we pay attention to our breath, the urge might be to breathe deeply. We may even find a draw to sigh, and I would just follow that. That's your body's intuition. Just follow that. So if your body is asking for a sigh, please do that. So in bringing our attention back to our knees, we can follow that energy and breath up into our thighs, our upper legs. Just bringing our breath there, really connecting. We might notice how our bodies are feeling, if they're feeling tight, if they're feeling relaxed, and there's no judgment, just noticing. As we bring that energy up into our hips and our pelvis, again, just feeling our breath there. Bringing our breath into our belly. And if it feels okay for you, you may wish to bring your hands onto your belly. You might want to feel the rise and fall of your breath in your belly. And while we're here, we'll take an opportunity to really breathe deeply here. So really filling up our belly with air, feeling that breath and that really fill up ourselves with that. And then letting it go. We'll just stay here in our belly for a few more breaths, since this is sort of a central point of our body. And anytime our mind might wander, thoughts might come up about what's next, something else that's going on, that's okay. Just bring yourself back to your breath, back to your body. And so from our belly, we'll just imagine that circle of light or energy coming up into our chest. Our breath moving through this place. Just circling up. And then bringing our breath into our fingertips. Maybe wiggling them just to acknowledge them and help our mind bring our breath there. So in our fingertips, into our hands, into our arms and elbows. We're just noticing what might come up in our bodies. What lives here? What connections do we have? Bringing that energy and light up into our shoulders and our neck. Maybe rolling those shoulders back and down again. Maybe giving our neck a little wiggle. Whatever feels good. And then just imagine that energy coming up through your face, up to the top of your head. And we'll just breathe here for a moment. So really finding that breath, connecting to this source of our body that really keeps us alive. It's also a tool for us to anchor at any time. And now I'd just like you, after doing that body scan, to just ask your body silently, where do you need me? Where do I need breath? And whatever comes is okay. Find that place in your body and just send your breath there. So mine's often in my shoulders and neck. That's where I tend to hold tension and stress. So wherever that is in your body, just bring your attention there. And we'll just really focus our breath there. So when we connect to ourselves through our bodies, can offer us a really beautiful opportunity. Redirect some of that energy we've been putting out into the world, into our work, into our families, into social justice and resistance. And when we come into our bodies, we create this opportunity for space. So just finding those places in your body, that place that's calling you for more space. And just bring your breath there. And in this space, we can give ourselves permission. Permission that may be denied to us in other parts of our lives. That permission to bring every part of ourself forward. That every part of us is welcome. So in our breath, I invite you to just bring that breath into your heart. Just imagine this breath living in your heart, expanding in the middle of your chest. You can bring your hands there if that feels good, or keep them wherever feels relaxed to you. And just in these breaths, reminding ourselves that we are here to sit in our wholeness. We are already whole. That all of us, all of me, all of you is welcome here. All of you is welcome here. Any masks we need to wear in the world, in our identities that are competing sometimes, they can fall away here. Any ways we need to hide, any ways we need to hide from ourselves or others can fall away here. And here we have a chance to, through our breath, come home to ourselves. So just come home to that breath, really noticing, really appreciating our breath, just welcoming whatever comes up. We can recall when we come home to our bodies, the DNA that flows through our veins, all the parts of us that have survived, that are alive, that are connected. We also have access to, if we wish, the idea that we are more than our physical form. And we can just expand into that, into our breath. You can maybe imagine your breath even going beyond your body, stretching out into a field beyond your physical body. And for me, when I do this, I like to imagine that my ancestors are also sitting with me in this place, in this field beyond my body, that they're supporting me, that they're sharing their wisdom. And in this space, I might be able to connect to their energy of resilience, and connect it to my own. And we can honor here all that we have been through, all that we continue to go through. And that by creating this space to just be with our breath, that this is radical, that welcoming every part of ourselves, every single part, is revolutionary. And that your existence is resistance in a colonial system. So just coming back to that breath in your heart, maybe it's expanded beyond your body, and just welcome yourself home. Welcome yourself home to your body, and remind yourself that all of you is welcome here. And we'll just sit with that for 3 more breaths. And so I'd like to just finish this practice with a special breath that I use. So just coming a little back into our body, maybe our field is becoming closer to us now. We can wiggle our fingers and toes to just come back to our presence in this room. And this last breath that we'll do to finish this practice is a pranayama practice. It's called breath of joy. So it's a 4-part breath. So it's 3 short inhales and 1 out breath. So if you want to just listen to me do it 1 time, and then we'll try it ourselves, okay? So remember, I can't hear you or see you, so it doesn't matter how silly you look or what you sound like. Hopefully you have space to be as loud as you like. So it's a so it's just helping us clear and release things that came up. So let's take a big breath in all together. Release that breath and come into breath of joy if you like. So it's a and then just sitting in that, maybe feeling the vibration or effect of this practice for another moment. And then just coming back to our bodies, back to the present moment, back to our conference, our shared space. I can't see any of you, but I'm hoping that that was took you somewhere that you appreciated, somewhere good. Again, if you have questions or anything that came up for you that you'd like to discuss further, please don't hesitate to send me a message. And thank you for sharing that with me.
Thank you so much, Sasha, for that grounding practice and really giving us a moment to arrive through honoring the past and the present. So right now we will direct our time to our panel and dive into a discussion about the value of radical self-care. So today on our panel, we have Patty Hamler, who identifies as an urban displaced Indigenous Canadian. She's a student affairs leader and educator who is passionate about lifelong learning, health promotion, and community building. We also have Dr. Ismael Trevore, who is a diversity, equity, and inclusion researcher, educator, and specialist. He is interested in issues of power and privilege, cultural competency, and multicultural organizational development. Part of his meditation practice is dedicated to healing from the impacts of racism. We also have Amal Rana, who is a widely respected inclusion consultant and racial justice organizer. Their work is informed by Muslim, feminist, and queer communities, amongst others. And then we have Tasha Nijar of Punjabi descent living in Vancouver. She has worked with various community and youth-led organizations using art, film, theater, and social media to amplify grassroots movements. So thank you all for being here today. And as we saw from the word cloud, there is a lot of commonality in the emotions being experienced due to this pandemic. And during this time, there's a lot of talk about maintaining not just one's health, but well-being, and also the importance of self-care. Today, however, we would like to engage in meaningful conversation that focuses on IBPOC-specific experiences related to well-being. So the first set of questions that we have for our panelists is that as the promotion of mindfulness and wellness activities increase during these times, what are specific strategies and approaches to care for IBPOC folks? And what does radical self-care really look like? So we'll begin with Patty.
Thank you so much, True Love, and to everyone who's helped us get started in a really good way for this session. I want to start by just doing a brief introduction of myself. I know there's a bit of information there, but just to give a sense of where I'm coming from and some of the reflections that I have on these questions. So first, a really brief introduction in my language that I'm reclaiming and learning at this time. So Tansi, Tawau, Nia Patty Hambler, Huhusis, Nitsuko-san, and Nia Nehiawisqueo. So I've just shared, my name is Patty Hambler, and the name given by my uncle and my dad is Little Owl, and just want to welcome you to this online space. So I have three key words that I wanted to share, just give some really brief reflections on. One is responsibility, the second is gratitude, and the third is relations. And I'm already seeing themes in what's been shared already today. But the first piece around responsibility, this has been a reframing for me of the notion of self-care. So really moving away from notions, and I see as being Western and colonial notions of self-care as being about the self, and reframing that to self-care as being about responsibility to others, responsibility for family, responsibility for community, responsibility for our ancestors who had the resilience to survive. And so we have that responsibility to continue on in this world. And in that reframing, I have encouraged others and myself to let go of any guilt that we might hold for taking care of ourselves at this time, because for me, that self-care is related to our responsibility for others. And so when I think of it that way, it's so imperative that I think of the ways in which I am looking after myself so that I can continue to offer myself in those ways to the broader community and to my family. And that holds for now as well as for the future. So I've found that in my conversations with others during this time, and especially with women, that there is some guilt that people hold, guilt that we hold as women, and guilt that we hold maybe for our privilege, if those of us who hold privilege that I acknowledge that I hold, and being able to continue to work and to have my family be safe around me. But acknowledging that guilt and letting it go so that we can continue to be responsible to look after ourselves and our family, and just giving us permission to let go of productivity as the goal, I think has been a really important piece that I've been reflecting on. Really briefly, because I want to pass over and give time for my co-panelists, I'll just mention the notion of gratitude has really come up for me as well under self-care, and this is really related, I think, a lot to what Linnea shared. For me, in having gratitude for the land and the role that has played in my care, and having gratitude and recognizing, despite the hardship that the pandemic has brought, there are things that are being acknowledged because of it. And so thinking about the way that we care for elders in our society in a different way, giving gratitude for the break that we're giving to Mother Earth in terms of a healing time, because we're all, we're not driving our cars, we're not having the same bad impacts on the environment at this time. So having gratitude and acknowledging those things, I think, has been something that's been a really important piece of this experience for me in thinking about self-care. And then the last piece is just about relations. And I'm going to come back to this when we come to the next question, but I think absolutely acknowledging what Linnea has shared earlier, and as well as Sasha, in that idea of colonization has resulted in disconnection for many of us. And in my identity as someone who is Indigenous and who is also living in an urban setting, I really trace that back to colonization and disconnection. And so for me, there's this constant striving for connection and community and the ways in which that can happen. And I think there's a responsibility for our institutions and for society to be thinking about that. And I'll come back to that when we come back to the second question. So I'm going to leave it there for right now and pass it over to the next panelist. Thank you, True Love.
Thank you, Patty. So we'll hand it over to Ismael.
Hi, everybody. My name is Dr. Ismael Trevore, and as mentioned earlier on, I really am a community builder involved in community engagement. But the hat that I wear today is more as somebody who has been involved in meditations and ceremonies, and discovering just last year that there's actually a lineage of shamans in my family, of which I was finally able to connect with and learn some plant medicine that they've used in West Africa, specifically from Ivory Coast and Burkina Faso, which I have been using and has been really helpful. But before I can specifically answer the question of strategies and approaches that racialized people and Indigenous people can use in order to nurture themselves, I do want to provide a framework or a hesitation of the idea of self. In the West, there tends to be an industry of the self. In other parts of the world, such as where I was born in West Africa, there's not so much an emphasis on self as there is an emphasis on the community. And an interesting study was done some years ago where individuals coming out of an airport would be given, would be asked to complete a survey and presented a variety of pens. And it was quite interesting to see, and the pens had different colors. It was quite interesting to see that people who came from a East Asian culture will often use the same colored pen. Like all of them will pick the pen blue. compared to people who came from a more Western part of the world, who were much more likely to pick a single color that was unique compared to the colors in the set. All to show that this emphasis on the self and therefore care can be very difficult for people like me, who doesn't really emphasize self as much as it's emphasized in the West. And also mindful that the more that we use the language of self-care, we are somewhat playing into the commodification of care, into capitalism, into deregulation, into privatization. I mean, self-care is a multi-billion industry. It's a multi-billion dollars market. And it became much more so the more that we started to see deregulation happening, the more we started to see increased forms of privatization. And so I find to me that sometimes the language about self-care is putting responsibility on the individual to address the maladaptation of society, to address the problems that society, the stresses that society create. And so I would love to see another framework that is more about social care and placing the responsibility not just on the individual, but the structures that create individuals to having to go out of their way, use their personal monies in order to take care of themselves. But with that said, I'm always interested in ways that I can do self-care that does not necessitate commodification, in the sense, does not necessitate me to buy something. And one form of care that I do that is also linked to my lineage is free-form dancing, which is also somewhat like ecstatic dancing. Here is where you're not dancing for the purpose of looking cool. You're not trying to, it's not a prescriptive dance. It's a dance of the emotion and the body. In other words, when people, animals are stressed or afraid, what they do is shake. And so even just yesterday, I turned off the lights and I was just dancing. There wasn't a particular step I was doing, but I was just allowing particular emotions to come out and express themselves. I've seen it used as well in South Africa after apartheid, in order for people to express and somewhat exercise themselves from the trauma of apartheid. And it's often done in groups, and it's important for it to be done in groups because it's important for it to be witnessed, because pain, stress is also experienced in groups. And this is also part of my critique of self-care, is that you experience stressors and traumas in the collective, in the structure, but then you're assumed to do the self-care alone, as if those two things are not related. And so to me, meditation as well is a very important aspect, is an approach that I take and that I've taken for over a decade that has been very helpful. What brought me into meditation and how I use meditation is in part to understand what I'm feeling inside and why it's happening, and also to lean into my feelings and my emotions. If I don't do that, it's very easy to stay, to live from the neck up and not go down below the neck. And in the Sufi tradition, they say that the longest journey anybody can make is from the head to the heart. And through meditation, I tell you, I realize that it's a long journey, and I think it's a journey for as long as one is alive, because the tendency in society is to emphasize that cognitive part, that rational part, and really forget about the other parts of our bodies. That long duality between mind and body of, male, white, Western scientists that have dominated our understanding of our body and of ourselves. I think it's still very powerful. So I would say strategies that IBPOCs can take is connect to whatever ancestral or heritages you have access to, in order to be able to express yourself in a way that makes sense to you. And to me, that's freeform dancing, ecstatic dancing, meditation, and also connecting with my niece. She just turned 1 year old, and there's nothing that brings me more joy than connecting with her on WhatsApp. And she started blowing me kisses, so I feel like a very fulfilled uncle right now. I will pass on the baton to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Ismael. You could change the slide. We will go with Amal.
Can you see me? Hi, can everyone hear me and see me?
Yes, we can.
Good. Hi, everyone. First of all, just thank you to the team that put this together for an amazing event. I'm already learning so much, and for all the work that went into it, and everybody who's joining us from apparently around the country and maybe beyond. It's really exciting to share space with you, even in this somewhat disembodied way, but I'm so glad that embodiment and the connection to land and all the really incredible wisdom that's been shared have been such a key part of the panel so far. So I wanted to start off by sharing my name again. It's Amal, and my pronouns are they and she, and I'm speaking right now from unceded Musqueam territories. And I think that, you know, in terms of situating myself and saying, I think it's all there in the bio. So all I would say is that I'm a settler on these lands. You know, I work as an inclusion consultant, longtime racial justice organizer, but my heart is really in my arts practice and community practice as an artist. That's always been deeply collaborative, especially as a poet. So that's the perspective I'm going to speak from a little bit. And I just wanted to start by, you know, in response to this question around strategies and approaches to care for IBPOC folks and radical self-care, by, you know, framing this in terms of the pandemic, and I think there's going to be crossover with what other speakers have said so far, that the pandemic, as we know, has further both, you know, exacerbated and cracked open the structural inequalities and the systems of power and oppression that so many of our IBPOC communities were already experiencing and facing. And I think that it made me really reflect on this panel in the sense of that not everyone has, as we know, the privilege to shelter in place or to ponder the questions we're pondering right now, or to be in this kind of conversation. So I think it's both such an incredible and necessary and urgent, you know, need for all of us as IBPOC. And I'm also really reflecting as I go into this conversation about how privileged I am to be a part of it, sitting at home, not worrying about food and other things. And I know that's not the case for so many of our communities. So I also wanted to, you know, start by framing what I'm going to share in terms of strategies by really a reminder for myself that care, whether it's self-care or, you know, ethics of community care, mutual aid, sustained solidarity and liberation, that all of this is happening and continues to happen here in the context of a settler colonial state, in the context of white supremacy, and particularly, I think, a foundation of anti-indigeneity and anti-Blackness. And of course, I'm sure on so many of our minds right now is the name of George Floyd. I want to just take a moment. Breonna Taylor, so many other Black lives that have been taken by the state and by police violence and by white supremacy, and also what's happening in Minneapolis. So I think as I've been thinking about how to speak on these things, all of these things have been on my mind. So for me, the key in terms of the two key components that come to mind from my perspective around self-care is really finding that balance between resistance, which we are always having to engage in, whether we choose to or not as IBPOC, and centering our healing, our liberation, and our care. So those are kind of, I think, the key components. And what I thought I would share, I also just have a few notes, and I thought, you know, to make this as succinct as possible and distill it, I'm just going to go through those. Some strategies that have worked for me and that have worked for the community of care that I'm in, and obviously they're not comprehensive and may not apply to everyone. But I think the first thing that comes to mind is really to put time into your own healing and community healing, and to reclaim, and I think Ismael talked about this too, and I think it's come up really with all of the speakers so far, is to reclaim our ancestral rituals and traditions of healing, and also then to give permission to ourselves to create new rituals, which is something that I think that I've struggled with, because I think that, you know, various structural factors such as colonialism, family alienation, there's so many things that come into play as to why you might be disconnected from some of our rituals and traditions ancestrally. And we don't all have the privilege to access those. And so really giving yourself permission to create those. And I think number 2, prioritize, cultivate, and find joy whenever and wherever you can. And I think that's an urgent project, not a project for the future, because often I think we think of joy or healing as something we're going to take aside time and spend the whole day on, or it's going to be a project, which of course it can be. But I think that we also need to really find that and cultivate moments of joy despite, you know, the grief and the rage and the anger and the anxiety, especially right now that we're going through, wherever we can in small ways, whenever possible. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't also, I think, own our rage and our anger and our anxiety and our grief. And for me, it means really giving myself to permission and a reminder that our rage and our anger, any of our emotions, never have to be palatable for the white gaze. We don't have to explain ourselves. So then I'm thinking, I think, in terms of a strategy, that self-care really has to be connected, as people have already raised, you know, and fed by an ethics of collective care, of community care, mutual aid, mutual solidarity, which is deeply embedded in, at least for me, and I'm only going to speak from my own perspective, culturally for me, in the ways that I've been raised in terms of Muslim cultures, also coming from a Jewish background, South Asian cultures, and really that self-care is deeply embedded within community care. And then number 4, looking at shifting your internal paradigm. This has been really huge for me. What does it mean to shift our internal paradigm in terms of care? Has really meant, in my life, decentering whiteness and recentering and prioritizing, whenever possible, IBPOC or BIPOC communities. Building into our communities instead of educating out. Of course, unless we're paid highly to do that work and choose to do it. But really, we spend so much of our time in a place of reaction, and we don't often have a choice. Violence is happening, it's systemic, we need to respond in the now, but also really choosing and trying to shift the paradigm internally to recentering our own communities instead of whiteness, because whiteness can be all-consuming. So number 5, and I just have, I think, this one and maybe another one, and then I'm just going to pass it on to the next speaker, is to remember, and this is connected, I think, to an earlier point, that nothing is neutral. And there is a wellness industrial complex, as we know, that we operate under in this society, in terms of, I'm talking about white supremacist society, not about indigeneity or other cultures. And wellness, you know, I think, is often used by the state and by institutions, and I will include academic institutions often in this, to uphold the status quo with a light dusting of diversity and a surface level commitment to well-being. And I think that's not enough, because what happens is that wellness is upheld as something that obviously we're all striving towards, without dismantling the structural inequalities and oppressions and the power systems that actually lead to IBPOC being unwell in academia, in the workplace, in community, in society. And I think as an example that comes to mind for me is that when we think of the wellness industrial complex, you know, I think that yoga is a really powerful tool. It's also part of my traditions. It's something that I rely on in terms of wellness. And at the same time, I think that there needs to start being a more critical analysis around yoga, also as a practice that has been both deeply embedded historically, but also is currently being used by a Hindu fascist government in terms of what's happening in India and with Prime Minister Modi, and the rise of Hindutva as a tool to actually not just exacerbate, but to embed communal violence, and particularly Islamophobia, anti-Dalit violence. And I want to acknowledge that a lot of the kind of learning I've been doing around this is coming and being led by Muslim and Dalit women. So I think that we need to also, like, there's a lot of conversations that are happening around yoga and appropriation and white people appropriating. If we're going to have those conversations, we also need to really look at how, when we're embracing wellness, what does that look like? What does it look like for me to go and harvest wild herbs as a settler on Indigenous land? What practices am I using? How am I implicated in the process of being both a settler and ensuring that I'm actually responsible for the ways in which I do my wellness? So I think that's really key, is that nothing is neutral. And I would just end on, one other example that I wanted to share is that I'm thinking of Bonnie Henry's, reminders to us, right? And a lot of people are relying on her for comfort and find her leadership very comforting. I'm not disputing that. I think from my perspective, what I keep hearing around the messaging around, we all have to be kind to each other. We're all family. We're all in this together. What struck me really about that in terms of, the kind of liberal white project of kindness and how that really doesn't apply to everybody, even when we want it to, is that I've spent, as people may know, recently Ramadan ended, and I spent my 3 of my Ramadan Sundays with amazing prison justice organizers outside prisons across the Lower Mainland as part of car solidarity demos to ask for health justice for those incarcerated, many of whom are Indigenous, because this is a real issue. You may have heard that at Mission Institution, that a large number of those incarcerated have been, have tested positive for COVID. It's something that's a real issue, not just here, but across Canada. Many of those, as I mentioned, are Indigenous. There's been a lack of healthcare and PPE and transparency. And what struck me was this one moment we were outside Mission Institution, making noise, letting those inside know that we could hear them, and they were responding in kind when we saw a number of correction staff go in full hazmat suits. And at the same time, one of the people inside behind bars yelled out, "Please save us." And that moment just for me was really brought home this kind of, I think, myth of liberal kindness and all of us being in it together, because clearly we're not. We're not in it together. We're not equally affected. And to me, that was a huge moment for my practice of care during Ramadan, was to really go out there and understand fully and be in solidarity to whatever degree I could with people who are not able to access kindness and being part of a family in ways that I am. Thank you.
Thank you. Tasha?
Thank you. Thanks to all the other speakers and panelists before. I feel like I have to say, I think that my ancestors are chuckling right now, because I was getting ready for this session and I knew that I wanted to speak about the importance of connecting with my ancestors and thinking about so many of the things that people have already said. And I don't know why. I guess because I'm really used to viewing myself as a bit of a weirdo, that might be how I would be perceived by talking about all these feelings and things related to spirituality, and then just to be in a space where that's being shared and spoken about by so many other people is incredibly reassuring, and I feel seen. And that was some of the direction that came up in both of the visualizations and the meditations that have been discussed so far, and a lot of the work. So I feel like the ancestors that I was trying to connect with as I was preparing for this are having a good chuckle right now, which I appreciate, because I think that's where I get my sense of humor. When I think about self-care, many of the things that I think about have been said by others. And one of them is that so much of it is about vulnerability, and being vulnerable and admitting that you have feelings and boundaries and limits and traumas, and that inform who you are and the way that you're able to show up. And that's not an easy thing to do, particularly when often for racialized folks, for Black and Indigenous folks and people of color, we're penalized for demonstrating emotions and seen to be reacting in a way that can be angry or over the top. And so one of the ways that I think we're taught to respond to that and to survive is by masking those emotions and not sharing them and not sharing any of our vulnerabilities and putting up a strong face and not bringing that into other spaces, because it's penalized sometimes quite heavily. And so there's risk that comes in with being vulnerable and challenging those systems. And so that to me is a part of such a big part of this work. And not at all the way that self-care is framed by capitalist colonial systems, where it's really seen as something that you do privately on your own, and you have to purchase these tools and resources to be able to do it, and you do it at home so that you can show up somewhere else as this well-rounded, completely adjusted person who can perform whatever tasks you're being asked to do at your school or your work. And that's really not the way that it works. When I was thinking about this, my own journey in this time, since we've been in physical distancing, or what I inaccurately refer to as quarantine for shorthand, when it first started, like so many other people, my life felt that it was flipped around, and it was confusing, and it was uncertain, and there was a lot of emotions that came up during that time. And I felt quite lost, and I recognize that I'm someone who has the privilege of having a job that I get to work at UBC or the Equity Office and work from home, and I have security that comes with having a home and an income source that I'm not worried about. And even for someone like me, that this time felt so precarious, and I can only imagine that that would be so much stronger if one's source of income or housing or other significant connections were precarious to begin with. So as Amal just said, that this is exacerbating already those inequalities that existed before. That said, even with this time, I, as someone who has some of those privileges, was feeling, really thrown off, and I didn't know how to ground myself, and tried to do some of the things that were recommended, like, go for a walk and trying to exercise or eat better. And those things did help, but there was still something that was missing, and I couldn't place it. And then a few weeks, maybe 2 weeks into what I'm going to call quarantine, I was asked by some folks who are involved with Sanctuary Health, which is a group that works around migrant justice and supporting undocumented communities, as well as Watari, which is a really incredible, for those of you that don't know, a really incredible organization that works on the downtown east side with a lot of leadership from people who've been part of that community for a long time, including Ingrid Mendez, who's a real mentor to me. They were doing food deliveries for families and asked if I could help with doing some grocery deliveries, and I said yes, of course. And after the first day that I did that, that was the first time that I felt some of the, not all of it, but some of the anxiousness and the unease that I was feeling start to move away. And I realized what it was is that I was reconnecting to my practice of community care, and that's actually what I needed. And when I was just focused on the self, it was never going to fulfill the needs that I had to be connected to community and to show up for other people in the way that's important to me. And this teaching also comes to me through my community, through my elders, and through my ancestors. And so within Sikhi and within Punjabi, we have this concept of seva that's really about showing up for your community and to give selflessly, and to be thinking about the needs of others. And there's so many ways that can happen. And so to me, this was really thinking about, how do I take this teaching that I have and apply it to this time where we're supposed to be physically distant from one another, when so many of the ways that I think about caring for people or having people care for me are about being together in spaces. And so how do we think about gathering and supporting each other and continuing to look out for one another's needs in this time? So I think about the teachings that I've had from my own ancestors and my elders, and then there's also teachings that I am so grateful to have received, and wisdom that comes from other sources, including reading about people who have experience in this. I think a lot about work that comes from the disability justice movement, and I wanted to share something from Stacy Milburn Park, who is recently passed away, was a disability justice activist, and she wrote in Care, Work, Dreaming, Disability Justice. So I'm just going to read the quote. "I have loved disabled people of color my whole adult life, and still amazed to discover the more I love our people, the more I remember where I come from. I remember my ancestors found each other, seeing each other in the unseen. My ancestors knew that asking after one another and making sure folks had what they need, what we might understand as collective access, was the only way to be together. Together, the best way at staying alive. My ancestors knew the power of vulnerability and how to hold each other in dignity. My ancestors knew joy. My ancestors made mistakes and meditated on who they wanted to be in community. My ancestors became those people." Yeah, so I think that is, there's so much, and I could meditate on those words for a long time, but they ring so true for me, and are such a guide when I think about what it means to show up for other people and to demonstrate collective care and think about mutual aid and access to resources. That's something that I was thinking about before, and is even amplified in this time of sitting and having quiet reflection. And the other thing that I wanted to share around that, well, I just got a message that I'm supposed to wrap up soon, so maybe I can, well, no, I'll do it quickly. The other piece that I wanted to share around that, which is really connected to what Linnea shared in the beginning, was around thinking of land. And so Maya Antoine, who's a Squamish woman that I've met through some of the language reclamation work that she's doing, recently posted thinking about land and this territory, and thinking about her territory, Squamish territory, that I'm currently on, the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And had very similar reminders about the fact that when we're on the land, we are not alone. You're never alone here. And so she says, "Instead, you are being held by the land and held by my ancestors. So when you're in my territory, I ask you slow down. I ask that you remember that there were many people here before you who hold a sacred connection to this land that cannot be explained in the English language. I ask that you think about those who will be here after you." And there's a lot more that she said about that, and I think that Linnea has also already touched on it, as have others, but also thinking about what is this connection to land and this dialogue that happens between my ancestors and the ancestors of this place, and how do I take those teachings and embody them in the way that I show up for myself and for other people.
Thank you so much, Tasha. So we are a bit short on time, so we're going to move on to the next section. But I think so far there have been some really key takeaways that, the notion of self-care for IBPOC folks is subject to much critique. And I think this points to a need for reframing what self-care means, or even looking at self-preservation, and also centering our healing and really connecting with our ancestors and our communities. So I can see that in the chat box, there have been a few requests to connect with the panelists. So there'll be a follow-up email with a list of the panelists, and also the resources that are being shared in the chat box currently will be shared at the end of the event. So we'll move on to the next section, which is looking at the role of radical self-care in academic institutions. So today we have a lot of people from various sectors, including academia, community groups, and the not-for-profit sector. And in these spaces, there's been an increased call to foster a culture of care and well-being. So we want to ask, what is or what should be the role of the workplace and institutional care in facilitating an environment welcoming of the well-being of diversity? And what are the challenges and recommendations? And we'll start with Patty again.
Thanks, True Love. Given the time, I will keep my remarks really brief and look forward to hearing my co-panelists' thoughts. But again, I want to come back to the notion of community and the responsibility of institutions to create spaces and allow for the creation of spaces where IBPOC folks can come together and feel safe and connected and build that sense of community, and how much that matters in our day-to-day lives, in our work lives. And that's the second part for me, is acknowledging that. And I feel like what has really been highlighted throughout this pandemic, for me, there has been, there's an artificial separation that people like to make between work and home life, and that idea that we are two different people almost. And I think this time has really highlighted how we are whole people that bring our whole selves to our experience. And so the blurry lines that have happened during this time about family and being a parent, for example, our connections to how we've been disconnected from our communities. All of this has highlighted that we are whole people, and in my work in student health promotion, that's something that I'm constantly reminding myself and those that I work with, is how important it is that we think of students as whole people, not as brains when they come into the classroom, and then other parts of their being when they're outside. And I think with that piece for the IBPOC community, it's important that institutions acknowledge and address the systemic racism that does exist within our institutions, so that we can feel like we can bring our whole selves into the workplace. And so when we're talking about the idea of how we can create better well-being, I agree 110% with the idea that we need to really move away from that concept of self-care and well-being being about the individual, and the whole commodification of that, as Ismael has highlighted for us, and really coming back to what it means to people to bring their whole selves to work, and to feel that they can be supported in that. So I'll leave it there and pass it over to the next panelist. Thank you.
Thanks, Patty. Can the question that we're answering be put on the shared screen so that I make sure I am answering the correct question, please? As that happens, I guess if I recall the question here, it's about what can institutions and workplaces do to nurture health in an organization? And there are many, many, many things they can do. This has been researched left, right, and center. And so I will just pick the one that speaks most to my experience. I think it's interesting to note that ever since quarantine has happened, I have felt physically a little bit better, and also psychologically a little bit better. So what has that told me, or what can that tell us about how being away from the workplace, at least for me, has increased somewhat a sense of well-being? Of course, there are pros and cons. And to me, what is the most direct relationship to my increase in well-being is I don't have to commute 3 hours to go to work and come back from work every day. And with these 3 hours, I have actually been using it to spend more time exercising. Go figure, very simple. There's something about being 3 hours on a bus every day that is very stressful. And Vancouverites have the habit of honking their cars a lot. So to me, turning this into an institutional potential initiative or strategy is maybe a little bit more satellite workplaces within neighborhoods. You know, UBC is a big, huge organization. And I'm wondering if it's possible for it to have, you know, more centralized offices so that workers would not have to commute 3 hours or sometimes even longer. And in the process of having satellite offices that are a little bit more closer to where people live, we will be helping the environment because we're driving less and therefore polluting less. And also it is much more healthy for there to be a sense of cohesion in where we work, where we play, and where we sleep. Right now, where I work is far from where I live, and it's very far from where I play. And therefore, I don't really get the chance to create a sense of community in the place that I live because I only live here and do everything else outside of it. And so I would say one thing is, can we have more localized satellites so that we can save on the commuting, we can have more time with our families, we can use those hours that we used to commute to do other things. Another thing I would suggest is we know there is a high relationship, a positive relationship between employees' sense of control over their work and their sense of satisfaction, which, however, is quite contradictory or stands in contradiction with a very hierarchical structure, organizational structure. So I feel that there are certain tensions in the university or in organizations that lead to employees feeling dissatisfied and having mental health breakdowns and feeling very burdened. And one of them is that on the one side, we are all about productivity, but on the second side, we're all about well-being. Well, those two things stand in contradiction because productivity tends to be about the bottom line. It tends to be about the criteria that makes a university the best university in Canada or in the world. Now, if that's the mindset that we want to be the best, the criteria for being the best tends to be those that are more privatization, deregulation, as I mentioned earlier on, saving costs, as opposed to a workplace that is more focused on the holistic, a holistic approach to well-being. And so I think we really need to reconsider the values that we have and how some of them exist in tension, and, you know, like giving workers a little bit more voice. You know, we have political democracy where, at least in our context, once every 4 years we can vote for a leader, but then within our institutions, it will also be a radical step for workers to be able to have a say in who they want as their leaders, to be able to have a say on some of the big decision-making processes that are going to happen, so that it's less top-down and more of a collaborative, collective, we are all in this together. So that will be some of my key things. And of course, it's important to have a balance between effort and reward. I find that a lot of racialized folks and marginalized folks in general may find themselves having to overcompensate and work doubly hard in order to be recognized and appreciated, or in order to fight some of the stereotypes that come their way. And so there has to be an acknowledgement, a balance between the work that is done and the reward that people get. I have other ideas, but hey, I'll wrap it up here. Thank you.
Thanks, Ismael. Amal?
Yeah, so much to say, but also so much has already been said by Patty and Ismael. So, you know, I really want to thank Patty for the point around being able to bring our whole selves that are often truncated between who we can be at home and who we can be in a workplace or an institution. I think that's such a key point. Thank you so much for raising that. And since you asked us to keep our, you know, remarks to like one main point, I guess I'll try to distill that again as quickly as I can. I think that first what comes to mind for me as, you know, someone who does this work as an inclusion consultant is that whether it's an institution or, you know, the academy or any other kind of like setting, including workplaces, I think it's really critical that there has to be a commitment and a recognition that we need to, if we're going to talk about well-being in these institutionalized settings that are deeply, of course, reflective of the societal inequities that we know already exist in our communities and societies that we experience, then there has to be a commitment to actual transformation and actual liberation and organizational change that goes beyond diversity, and that doesn't, that doesn't replicate models of well-being that are part of an institution that's already harming people. So we don't want to replicate and mirror, and I think that can often happen whether it's through employment assistance programs in workplaces like EIP programs or other, even harassment investigations or the kinds of processes around investigating if someone comes forward with a complaint about racism. Often, as we know, and I think that Sarah Ahmed has done some great work around, the whole framework of complaints and the re-victimizing of the people who are actually impacted by racism or putting forward a complaint through the process of going through, bringing forward a complaint. So I think we need to recognize that these structures often replicate even when we're trying to do good work. And I also think that it's really key, and this has been part of my work around Islamophobia, particularly at a structural level, is to recognize that racism and the issues that we face in terms of oppression and the ensuing trauma, which is intergenerational, these are health and safety issues that we need to have a conversation where the framing has to be that this is a health crisis that's happening currently, and that this crisis needs to be addressed as a healthcare issue at a national level, at a provincial level, at a municipal level, within our institutions and our workplaces, and that we need to address racism as a health and safety issue. And I know that's happening in some ways, but I don't think there's enough of that work happening. And so what does that look like in terms of entrenching that in legislation, in policies and procedures, in workplaces and in institutions? And I also really just wanted to leave, end by saying that I also think that we need to center and bring back in the voices of the disappeared from institutions and workplaces. And what do I mean by that? I'm talking about the people who are pushed out of, so where are the BIPOC or the IBPOC or the, particularly I think BIWOC, so, and non-binary folks who are gone, who have been pushed out because of racism, who we're not hearing from, who are forced out either temporarily, whether it's on leave, or who are untenured, or who don't have power, or who don't get elevated to positions of power within the institution because they speak up. And I think that's really, really important to acknowledge who gets elevated even within our BIPOC communities and who doesn't within institutions and academia, and what that reflects. And so where are the voices of the people who have signed non-disclosure agreements, who have been silenced, who can no longer speak, who have been threatened that their academic careers will now, be destroyed because they've taken the risk over and over to speak? I'm really interested in us taking leadership, because I think wellness is about really looking, if we're going to talk about looking at the margins, that's what looking at the margins looks like for me, is to really find the people who have been so deeply affected that we're not even able to hear from them on discussions like this.
Thanks so much to everyone else. In the interest of time, I'll try to keep this short so that we can have some space to wrap up together before we get to the end of our time. I want to echo what everybody else has already said, and add to that I was having a conversation yesterday with two really amazing student leaders that I'm working with this summer, that I have the pleasure of working with this summer, K2 Malassi and Marcus Reed, and they were both sharing about how in this time there still feels some expectation to, show up or produce or to work as normal, whatever normal is, and that expectation wasn't working before, and it's definitely not going to work during this time, and we really need to recognize that the expectations around what professionalism looks like or what productivity, they were always rooted in colonialism and white supremacy and capitalism and weren't working. And we can really see that in this time, that especially as with Patty mentioning, like where our home lives and our work lives are intersecting so much, we see those like cracks and how unstable this system is that keeps us separated in these ways. And so to just think about those things and to challenge the system. There's a lot of policies that are in place, and we're seeing how quickly they might need to be shifted. But these are, accommodations and changes to the work environment that people have been asking for a long time. Yesterday, we had a session with Shagufta Pasta, who's speaking about being Muslim in higher education, and she was saying that this Ramadan was the best Ramadan she had in terms of her workplace, because it was at her home and she could have all of the needs met that she needed around that. And I know for some people that I know who are living with and navigating disability, that's also been true, that there's been some improvements to be able to like do what you need to do to take care of yourself during the day that can't always happen in the workplaces that we've set up. And that's true for students and staff and faculty. And so how do we take this opportunity to continue actually with building arrangements about doing our work that are going to meet people's very specific needs, and to not blame them or have people be perceived as weak or complaining for having needs, and instead create a culture and an environment where we encourage people to share what they need and adapt our systems to make room for that. And finally, I think we also need to make a lot more room for grief within the work that we're doing, within the institutions that we are a part of, within the communities that we're a part of, because it's showing up in lots of ways. And I mean that in the obvious ways of that in this time with the health crisis, people are losing their lives, but also the grief of a system changing, of the ways that we've been together shifting, and to have space for those emotions to be brought into the way that we are together. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Tasha. Wow, our time has flown by really fast. We do have a couple of questions that have come forth in the chat. I'll just take a look quickly. And Carmen had asked that, as a leader in my community, how do I have any, do you have any idea how I should support a person who experiences discrimination if I am present at this moment? Did you want to answer that one, Tasha, or?
I think I've just left my sound on from before, but I suppose I can. It was, unless anybody else from the panel wants to, but it was, how do you support someone if you're in a position of leadership?
Yes.
I'm not sure exactly what the context of leadership is, but I do think and it's come up before, this idea of responsibility, that if you're in a position of leadership, there's a responsibility that comes with that to really show up for the people who are around you, particularly those who are experiencing oppression or discrimination or violence in some form. And so how do you make it very clear to that person and to the other people around that that is not the type of environment that you're trying to create? And how do you engage in dialogue and support the learning of other people, and maybe take with the consent of that person some of the labor off of doing that education and that, and support that shift in culture within your team. And then I think, so you address that moment, but then you also look back at like what allowed it to happen, and likely there are some policies or practices in place that allowed things to get to where they are in this time, and what are the structures that supported that to be in place, and how do you address those and shift those from your position, and have that really be informed by the people who've experienced the discrimination, harassment, violence, to see like what is their insight and knowledge and how to shift this culture and shift this system.
That's great. I think for now we can have our panelists turn on their videos and unmute your mics as I ask the questions. We had another question that is asking, how do we reclaim kindness as a liberal white project? Or the concept of kindness.
Can you repeat the questions? How do we reclaim? How do we reclaim whiteness as a project of liberal
the
whiteness?
question was, how do we reclaim the concept of kindness? I think somebody had mentioned that it's being seen as part of a liberal white project. And the question is, how do we reclaim that as IBPOC folks?
I think I had talked about that in my responses. And I think that I had said that, of course, the way it's iterating in terms of the government's message, right, is comes across definitely in terms of part of a project of liberalness. And that wasn't about kindness generally being the issue. So I think, to me, and I'm sure other panelists have thoughts on this, I think that kindness is very much actually part of our, at least I can speak for myself. I don't want to speak for other cultural traditions and generalize, but I think for me, it's very much part of the cultural traditions and background and ways of being that I've grown up with. And that includes the spiritual ways of being as a Muslim and as a Jewish person. And I think that reclamation is really already happening for us. I think it's something we embody on a daily basis in everything that we do. And it's part of our community care frameworks. I think that what I was referring to really was the ways in which we see kindness, right, being specifically framed and appropriated and being used to by the liberal white project. In this case, I was talking about the ways in which Bonnie Henry is using it, that yes, of course, there's this reference to how it's for everybody and how we're all in this together, with an acknowledgement, and sometimes from her, that of course there are differences within that, but at the same time not actually tangibly including everyone. And so what does that look like for people who are left out and who are deeply vulnerable, whether it's at a meatpacking plant and are majority racialized workers, or at a prison where so many of those incarcerated are, for example, Indigenous. So I don't want to take up more time because I think other people can probably speak to this.
Sorry, Ismael, you're on mute.
There we go. Thanks, Amal. And actually, to go off of that, there are two sayings that summarize my answer to this question. One is by Dr. Cornel West, who says, "Justice is what love looks like in action." So justice is what kindness looks like in action, I would say. The second one is going beyond kindness as a well-intended good feeling of treating somebody the way that you would like to treat them, and using the platinum rule instead, which is treating somebody the way they would like to be treated. So doing, you're acknowledging that there are different ways that people define kindness, that people want to be supported and that people want to help. And you're developing cultural competency when you start asking yourself, well, what does kindness look like from this person, as opposed to assuming from the set of my identities that I know what kindness looks like for that person. And as a racialized person, I can tell you without any certainty, with a lot of certainty, that there are a lot of wonderful Caucasian white colleagues whose understanding of kindness sometimes, or a lot of time, is in conflict with what I need when I am the victim of racism, which is tied to that first question: what can you do if you witness somebody experience racism? Well, speak to them. Try to identify, try to see any indications if they're okay for you to approach them, and being mindful that if you're white and the person just experienced racism from another white person, maybe they will react to you differently. So, but that's a nuance. But in general, I would say institutions need to have psychologists, counselors who have an expertise in anti-oppression and anti-racism. I find myself sometimes needing counselors and seeing that they don't have the cultural competency. And when I bring out issues of racism during my counseling sessions, sometimes it leads to backlash, or it leads to a lot of awkward silence and then it doesn't really help. So I would say there needs to be a creation of a wraparound service. And I know that in Vancouver and other places of BC, they have the ORA networks, the Organizing Against Hate and Racism, which are committees and organizations that have developed a protocol to responding to racism. So one way is to also give somebody the resource or the contact of where in their community they can find an ORA network to support them.
I'll just say that sometimes kindness, like sometimes telling somebody the hard truth is actually quite kind. And so maybe we need to rethink what being kind is, and it's not associated with necessarily always being nice and polite. Sometimes the kind thing is telling somebody something they really need to hear and not sugarcoating it.
That's a really great point. Thank you, Tasha. So just looking at the time, we are quite short. So in keeping with it, I'll just like to say thank you so much to everyone, and thank you to our panelists for their really thoughtful reflections, ideas, and even ways to go forward in terms of thinking about self-care and radical self-care. So I'll hand it over to Miriam for some closing remarks.
Hi, everyone. Can you see me there? Yes. Thank you all for staying with us for the full 2 hours. Amazing. This has been such a great session, and it's given us so much to reflect on in terms of not just the layers of how care intersects with our experiences of inclusion and exclusion, but also the ways in which we're all actually part of that relationship between resistance and oppression. And the role in this last section, the role that institutions have in acknowledging and creating space for folks to bring in their whole selves to the workplace in ways that foster opportunities for wellness, and kind of that tension of what that looks like within an institutional space. And I think the project, in many ways, at least the work that I do, is to nudge towards a paradigm that's not just empathetic towards difference, but actually centers that difference. And I think these conversations really help us to move in that direction. Before we leave today, we'd like to hear from you from one last polling question, if you have the appetite for it. And this is something we would like to share with all of you in a follow-up email. How do you practice radical self-care during this time? So what does radical self-care mean to you? We've had this conversation, but how do you practice it during this time? And I think the link will go back up in the chat if you've closed it already. So how do you practice radical self-care? And I think I'll sign off from there. And thank you, everyone, for all the presenters, for your insights and your wisdom. And also to all of you for staying with us. We will follow up with an email with some of the resources that have been shared in the chat, and the contact information of the speakers. I know a number of you said that you wanted to reach out to them. So thank you, and please take care of yourselves for the remainder of the day. Enjoy the sunshine. Bye-bye.